everybody, and thanks very much for coming along to our webinar today, especially for you guys at Columbia University. So this is everything you need to know about non-resident tax, navigating the non-resident tax journey. So I suppose firstly, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Elvira King and I'm an account manager here at Sprintax. I will also be joined by my colleague Jonathan, who will guide us through the using Sprintax piece a little later. And my colleague Neil Duffy is also here in the background, ready and waiting to assist with any questions that you may have along the way. So I can see there's still some people joining there and connecting to audio. So we'll give it just a second and we'll get started then. So before we get started, just firstly wanted to quickly cover some housekeeping. So you'll notice that the webinar is muted to attendees, and that's simply just to manage background noise because there's a lot of attendees on today's session. But if you do have any questions or any feedback, we'd love to hear them. Please do use the question box. I will say that a lot of your questions will be answered throughout the session, but if there's anything that we don't cover or anything you'd like a little more clarification on, please feel free to pop your questions in. Also, we are recording today's session and we will make that recording available to everybody later. So we'll send an email in a couple of hours with a link to today's webinar recording. So don't worry too much about taking notes or anything like that. You will have access to the recording afterwards. In terms of a disclaimer then, I suppose we'll always start a session like this with a disclaimer. So the aim of the presentation today is to provide you with a general understanding of tax principles as they apply to international students. And as such, it's for informational purposes only. Each individual has a unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and compliance. So basically what we're saying there is that we can't give you individual tax advice on a session like this. That is the job of the Sprintax software itself. But we'll definitely give you a good understanding of the tax principles as they apply to you. So let's have a look at what we'll cover today. So we'll look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars. So we'll look at things like, am I resident or non-resident for tax? Who needs to file? We'll look at different income documents you may receive. We'll then look at tax changes and important considerations for the 2025 tax year. We'll look at understanding the implications of filing an incorrect tax return or maybe not filing at all and what you need to do in those situations. We'll then have a look at using Sprintax. So Jonathan will guide you through what it looks like when you sit down to prepare your tax return using Sprintax so that you're familiar with that, and you're comfortable when you're sitting down to prepare your tax return. And then, of course, we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So like I said, that question box is there. If there's anything you'd like to ask, please do use that. So firstly, looking at important dates for 2025. And I suppose the tax year runs the same as the calendar year. So we're looking at everything that you've earned, any income that you've received, any days of presence in the US between January 1st and December 31st, 2025. So the 2025 tax year, it's the same as the calendar year. But the tax filing deadline then, really important date to be aware of, is April 15th, 2026. So you do need to have your tax return submitted by that April 15th deadline. Now, we would always recommend that you get your return submitted as soon as you've got everything you need. Don't delay, don't leave it until closer to that tax filing deadline. And if it's a case you're mailing your documents in, if you don't meet the IRS criteria to e-file, which we'll chat a little bit more about later, and if you need to mail those documents, please make sure that you do send them on time. You'll need to be submitting them at least a week before that April 15th deadline. There are some changes coming up with the IRS or the Postal Service, I should say, in terms of postmark changes. So previously, as soon as you've mailed your document, it would be postmarked at that, I suppose, at the earlier stage. But now they won't be postmarked until the mail reaches the sorting centre and not at that earlier stage. So it can take a couple of days longer. So it is really important that you do get your return submitted about a week before that deadline to be on the safe side. So one of the first things we'll always look at when we're looking at non-resident taxes is residency for tax purposes. And it's important to mention that residency for tax purposes, it's independent of your visa or immigration status. So although you may be non-resident on your immigration status, you could actually be resident for tax purposes. Because when it comes to resident versus non-resident for tax, it's all based on the number of days you've actually spent in the US. So generally, most international students or scholars on F, J, M, or Q visas are considered non-resident for tax purposes. But the rule that the IRS follow is that if you're an F1 or a J1 student, generally you will be considered non-resident for the first 5 calendar years here in the US. And after that 5-year period, then the IRS will look at what's known as the substantial presence test. So that can sound a bit like a crazy maths equation, but essentially the substantial presence test, it's looking back at the previous 3 years, and it's looking at your days of presence to determine your residency status. So it'll look at all of your days of presence in the year you're filing for, so we'll say 2025 in this case. It'll take 1/3 of your days of presence in the year before that, and 1/6 of your days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to 183 days or more, then you would be deemed resident for tax purposes. Now, if you're considered resident for tax purposes, Sprintax won't allow you to proceed any further than step 1, as you would need to use a resident provider, like our resident partner TurboTax. But the good news is you don't need to worry about the calculations. Sprintax will work all of that out for you. So all you need to do is to fill in your details in step 1. We'll ask for your entry and exit dates and the information we need to determine your residency, and we'll work that out for you free of charge. So if you're not sure, just go in and complete step 1 and we'll work that out. Now, you've heard me mention there a calendar year. So if, for example, Jonathan entered the US on December 30th, 2025, but a semester at his university didn't start until February 2026, the IRS will actually count 2025 as Jonathan's first year of presence in the US, even though he's only spent 2 days in the US in 2025. So just to be aware of that in terms of calendar years. Residency rules then, they change slightly for researchers or scholars on J visas. So if you're a researcher or scholar on a J visa, instead of that 5-year grace period where you're considered non-resident, you actually only get 2 years. And after you've been in the US then for 2 years on that J scholar or research visa, the IRS will then look at the substantial presence test. Now, this next slide, it's just a quick summary slide. It outlines the different visa types, the number of years each visa type is exempt from the substantial presence test, and if there's a FICA exemption available. So you'll see here, for example, the F1 and J1 student are exempt from the substantial presence test for 5 calendar years and have that FICA exemption, whereas many of the other J1 categories then would fall under that 2-year rule. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the recording with everyone later, so if you want to look back over any of this in more detail, you will have access to the recording to do that. So looking at who must file then for the 2025 tax year, really important to be aware that every non-resident who is an exempt individual must complete Form 8843, irrespective of income or days of presence. So everyone on this session today, if you were present in the US for any time during the 2025 tax year on an F, J, M, or Q visa as a non-resident, you do need to submit at least Form 8843, even if you didn't receive any income. For anyone that did receive any income at all in 2025, any US source income over $0, then it will trigger the federal filing requirement, which is the 1040 NR. So previously, there was a personal exemption where you could earn up to a certain amount before you would trigger that federal filing requirement. That has been abolished. So now anything you earn over $0 will trigger that filing requirement. So if you earn $50, you will trigger a filing requirement, for example. So really important to be aware, everyone on today's session needs to do something if you were present in the US in 2025, even if you didn't receive any income. So what is Form 8843? Well, as I said, it is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US, and essentially it's a declaration of your non-resident status for the tax year. It's a pretty straightforward document. It'll request your name, your address, the type of visa you're on, and the number of days you've spent in the state. And by giving that information then, you've completed your obligation for Form 8843 filing. Also important to mention, I suppose, that Form 8843, it's also known as a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. So you may be thinking, well, what on earth is that? Well, if you think of it as a declaration of your non-resident status with the IRS to basically say, hey, my name is Elvira, I'm an F1 student. Because I'm still non-resident for tax purposes, I'm still an exempt individual. So please don't count my days of presence in the US towards that substantial presence test we spoke about earlier. Again, it is a fairly simple form. If you only need to submit Form 8843, you don't need to have a Social Security number or an ITIN if it's just Form 8843 you're filing. And the good news again here is that Sprintax will prepare this form for you. So you don't need to go ahead and fill this out yourself. We'll prepare this form for you once you provide the required information in the Sprintax questionnaire. But again, it is the minimum filing obligation with the IRS for all non-residents in the US. So looking at the type of income that will trigger that federal filing requirement then, the 1040 NR. So the first and the most common, I suppose, would be employment income. So maybe you have an on-campus employment and you receive wages for that. Or maybe you receive a scholarship that covers costs other than tuition or tuition-related expenses. So if your scholarship covers room and board or living expenses. Maybe you've received a prize or an award, or you've got investment income. Or some of the other types of income, less common, but nevertheless will trigger a filing requirement. Maybe you've been to Vegas and you've won on the slot machines, or you've attended a focus group and you've received a gift card in payment for that. Or maybe you've got a spare room in your apartment and you've rented that out on Airbnb for over 14 nights. All of this is reportable and will trigger a federal filing requirement. On the other side, there are some incomes which don't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. So looking at these then, we've got money transferred from parents or relatives overseas. So if your parents or your relatives send you some money to live on when you're in the US, they're sending that from overseas, you don't need to report that on your non-resident US tax return. This is foreign source income. It's not US source income, so it doesn't need to be reported on your tax return. Income earned in your home country. So maybe you had a job before you arrived in the US and you bring this money with you. Again, it's not US source income and the IRS are not concerned with that. Interest on regular savings accounts then. So I suppose if you have a regular Bank of America account, for example, that's going to be tax exempt. But if you have the likes of I suppose, a Robinhood investment account that's accrued a lot of interest each year, in that case, the IRS may be interested in that. But for a regular savings account, it doesn't need to be reported. A scholarship, a fellowship grant, a targeted grant, or an achievement award received by a non-resident alien for activities conducted outside the US is treated as foreign source income and not reportable on your tax return. So for example, if you receive a scholarship from your home country to travel to the US to study, the IRS are not concerned with that because it's not US source income, it's foreign source income. So you've probably noticed from my accent that I'm from Ireland. So if, say, Trinity College in Dublin decide to send me to the US to study for a semester, the scholarship that I receive from Trinity College in Dublin, it's something that I will likely pay tax on back home in Ireland, but it's not something that I need to include on my non-resident US tax return. So you'll see the trend here. As a non-resident, you need to report your US source income. If you receive income from outside the US as a non-resident, it's not reportable. Now, if you've been in the US long enough to be considered resident for tax purposes, in that case, you would need to report your worldwide income. But while you're considered non-resident, it's just your US source income that needs to be included. So next, we're going to look at some of the income documents that you may receive. So the first is a W-2, and Form W-2 is probably the most common document that you could receive. It'll outline your wages, your salary, compensation. It'll include any income that you've earned and any tax that was withheld on that income. Also, just to be aware that if you've worked for more than one employer, you would expect to receive more than one W-2. You should receive one from each employer if you've had more than one employer. The deadline to receive a W-2 is January 31st. So, if you were expecting a W-2, you should have received that by January 31st. The second document then is the 1042S document, and that document pretty much outlines everything else, anything else that you might receive. So it could be taxable scholarship. So if your scholarship covered anything outside of tuition, it is considered income. But if it covers just your tuition, then it's not reportable. But if your scholarship covers anything outside of tuition, you would receive a 1042S document for that. If you've received income that's exempt by tax treaty, that would be reported on a 1042S document. Or maybe your royalty payments, prizes, awards, anything outside of wages or salary will generally be reported on a 1042S document for you. Now you'll see the little stars at the bottom here, just an important point to note. Forms 1099 are tax forms that are intended for US tax residents only. However, non-residents do frequently receive them, so you can and absolutely should include all income in your tax return, regardless of the form used to report it to you. So generally you'll receive a W-2 or a 1042S form, or both, if necessary. You might receive a 1099 document, but any of those income documents that you would receive, they should all be included on your tax return. Now, two important things to mention here. One is that not everybody will receive all of these income documents. You'll only receive the income documents relevant to you if you've received any type of US source income. Secondly, it's important to wait until you've got your income documents before you sit down to prepare your taxes. So if, for example, you received wages from an on-campus employment and maybe you received a prize or an award as well, and you'd expect to receive a 1042S for that. In your case, because you're receiving two different types of income reported on two different forms, you need to wait until you've got both of those forms before you sit down to prepare your taxes. You'd need to report any US income that you've received. So it is important that you've got all your documents before you sit down to prepare. Now, obviously, if you've received no income at all, you've just been in the US to study, you didn't have an on-campus employment, you didn't receive a scholarship or a prize or an award or anything like that, then you won't receive any of these documents. And it's just Form 8843 that you need to submit. So you'll be able to go through the process in Sprintax, which Jonathan will show you a little later. When we ask if you've received any income in the US, you'll say no to that, and you'll skip past those income details section then, and we'll prepare the relevant Form 8843 for you. So Form 1098T then, just to mention this as we're talking about forms, this is, I suppose, the #1 form of misfiling every year for non-residents. So Form 1098T, it's a tuition statement. And this is something that is intended for US residents only. But sometimes all students with a social security number on file with their school will get one, even non-residents. So it can cause a bit of confusion. So if you receive Form 1098T and you're non-resident, just put it away somewhere safe for your own records. You won't need it when it comes to filing your tax return. It's only for residents when filing their taxes. So this is not something that Sprintax will ask for any information on. It's not relevant in terms of filing taxes. If you're sitting down to prepare your tax return, and you are being asked for information from Form 1098T and you're non-resident, you're in the wrong place. You're probably sitting on the likes of a TurboTax website, and that is not relevant to you as a non-resident. You need to ensure that you're filing a correct tax return. But just to be aware, if you receive Form 1098T, put it away somewhere safe. You won't need it when you're sitting down to prepare your taxes. Next, then, we're looking at non-resident spouse and dependents and how they should be treated when it comes to tax. So I suppose the IRS, they are pretty strict on how your spouse and dependents should be treated. If they didn't receive any income at all, they still need to complete Form 8843, the same as you. And if they did receive any US source income, they're present in the US and they did receive any US source income, then they will need to file the federal return, the Form 1040NR. And if they're in a state where there's state tax, they may also trigger a state filing requirement. So they basically have the same rules as you, the primary visa holder. Also important to mention here that non-residents can't file a joint return. You can't file jointly as non-residents. So if you and your spouse are non-residents, you can't file jointly. You must file separately. However, if you're a non-resident and you're married to a resident, then you could elect to file jointly on your spouse's resident tax return. But we would recommend that you do the math on both options first to see which option would be more beneficial to your tax position. Next, then, we're looking at FICA taxes. And firstly, what is it? So I suppose if you're in the US at the age of 65 and you need assistance paying your medical bills, FICA tax would assist with that. But the thinking is, as a non-resident international student or scholar, the chances are you're probably not going to be in the US at the age of 65 to benefit from that. So for that reason, there's a general rule that if you're an F1 or a J1 visa holder and you're non-resident, you should not be paying FICA. You're exempt from FICA. Now, important to be aware that H1B, J2 and TN visa holders are subject to FICA taxes from the first day of employment. But the primary visa holder, the J1 or the F1 visa holder, shouldn't be paying taxes while you're still considered non-resident. Now, you can always check your W-2. If you're unsure if you've had FICA withheld, check your W-2. There will be a section on there that says FICA or Social Security or Medicare. And if tax has been withheld, and if you're on an F1 or a J1 visa, then you should firstly ask your employer for a refund. But if that doesn't work out, you can definitely apply for a refund with the IRS via Form 843 and 8316, because you will get all of that back. Now, this is certainly something Sprintax can assist with. So after you've asked your employer for a refund, if that doesn't work out, then we can certainly assist you with the FICA application if needed. Just to show you a quick comparison of the impact that FICA taxes can have on your wages if they're withheld incorrectly. So for example, here you'll see the F1 student earning $20,000 could have $1,530 of FICA withheld, whereas the J1 research scholar earning $50,000 could have $3,825 of FICA withheld. And that's the student portion only. So you can see you could have a significant amount of money being withheld from your paycheck that didn't need to be withheld. So it's always good to ensure that your employer is aware of your tax position, that you are non-resident, you're on an F1 or a J1 visa, then you're exempt from paying FICA. It just saves you the hassle of having to go ahead and claim those refunds back later and having that tax withheld throughout the year. So up until this point, I've chatted about how everyone on the session today needs to do something when it comes to taxes, even if you didn't receive any income. You need to submit at least Form 8843, but if you did receive any US income over $0, it will trigger a federal filing requirement, the 1040 NR. Well, you could also trigger a state filing requirement. And state tax rules differ from state to state, where some states will say that you only need to file if you earn over $17,000. Some will say you need to file if you earn over $8,000, for example. Some will say you need to file from the very first dollar. And of course, we know there are some states where there's no state tax. But it can also depend on things like your visa type, the number of days you've spent in the state, and even down to the type of accommodation you've lived in. So it can be quite complicated, but again, the good news here is that Sprintax will work all of this out for you. So once you fill in your information in the Sprintax questionnaire, we'll work everything out and we'll prepare the relevant forms for you, including your state tax returns if needed. So next up, we have ITIN, and I know this can definitely be a bit of trouble area, and it definitely causes some headache and heartache for you as international students and scholars, but I'm sure also for your school. But for anyone that may be unfamiliar, ITIN stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, and it's generally required by individuals who receive taxable income and they need to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible for a social security number. So it can be pretty common and most common among scholarship recipients, such as athletes, for example. Now, in terms of the application process, the application form is the W-7 and it can be applied for in advance of filing the federal tax return or alongside the federal tax return. But the process does change depending on which route you're going to go down. So in terms of applying for an ITIN in advance of filing the federal tax return, a responsible officer at the school can certify copies of the required documents. But where the process changes then is where you are applying for an ITIN alongside your federal tax return. So if you're sitting down to prepare your taxes and you realize you don't have a tax identification number and you've triggered the filing requirement, you need that tax identification number, you can actually apply for an ITIN at that stage. And when you're using Sprintax, we can prepare that form for you. We'll prepare the W7. But I suppose at this stage, when you're applying for an ITIN alongside your federal tax return, the responsible officer at the school can no longer certify the documents unless they're a certified acceptance agent. So in this case, if you're applying for your ITIN alongside your tax return, you'd need to have your documents certified by a CAA, a certified acceptance agent, or a local IRS office, or at the governmental department that issued your identification document, or at a US embassy or consulate. So it can be a little more complicated or a little more difficult for you in terms of who you need to get to certify those documents. Now, important to mention that not everybody will need an ITIN. If you have a social security number, you do not need an ITIN. Or if you are somebody who hasn't received any income at all and you only need to submit Form 8843, in that case, you don't need to have a social security number or an ITIN. I suppose if you receive any income, you'll generally have that social security number. So this ITIN will generally be for somebody like an athlete who's receiving a full ride scholarship that covers living costs outside of tuition. In that case, you mightn't have a social security number, you'd need an ITIN. But again, not everybody will need it. And if you have the social security number, you do not need the ITIN. So quickly looking at timelines for a refund. So if you are due a refund on the federal taxes, the IRS will say that it generally takes between 6 weeks and 6 months for that refund to come through. Now, I know it's a massive time frame there, like a difference between the two. We normally see that it's closer to the 6-week period and even quicker in a lot of cases, especially if you've qualified to e-file your federal return. Now, if you want to follow up on a refund, you can always visit irs.gov/refunds and you'll be able to check the status of your refund there. Now, you will need some information, you'll need to enter some information there to get the update. So if you need to check your social security number or your tax identification number or anything like that, you can always log into your Sprintax account and access your completed return in there and get any of that information. In terms of state refunds, if you're due a refund of state taxes, we would say allow a similar time frame. But if you do need to follow up on a state refund, you would need to reach out to the particular state, directly. So then looking at tax changes and important considerations. So I suppose one of the big changes for 2025 was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And I'm sure you've probably all heard bits and pieces about this. So just quickly to cover some of the more important things for you as non-residents to be aware of. So tip income is now non-taxable up to $25,000. The state and local tax deduction has increased to $40,000 for 2025. The standard deduction level is now permanent, but that'll only be relevant to students from India or other tax residents, so won't be relevant to everybody. Overtime pay is non-taxable up to $12,500. There's a 1% tax on remittances. So many international students, faculty and staff send money back home. So there is a 1% excise tax on transfers by cash, cashier's check or money order. And it also permanently reinstates the above the line charitable contributions for non-itemizing filers. So again, probably, you won't need to worry about too much of this, but I suppose just to be aware, because it was a pretty big thing in 2025, just to highlight some of the main points of that One Big Beautiful Bill Act for you as non-residents. So next we're looking at the implications of misfiling or maybe not filing at all. So there may be some of you on today's session that are sitting there thinking, okay, well, I've been in the US for a number of years and I didn't know I needed to do anything. I haven't filed. Or there may be someone there who is thinking, okay, well, I filed in the past, but I filed as a resident, so I filed incorrectly. Well, the good news is you can always set the record straight. So what we'd always say is don't panic, but do set that record straight. It is important that your tax record is correct and up to date for every year that you've been in the US. So if you've never filed at all, definitely catch up, and you can do that at any time. And if it's a case you're due a refund in the previous 3 years, the IRS will actually issue that to you. But if you're due a refund further back than 3 years, unfortunately, they won't issue a refund further back than that. But on the other side, if it's a case you owe them money, there's no 3-year cutoff point. They will expect you to pay that back as far back as needed. But it is important to catch up. If you've missed years, even if it is just Form 8843, catch up, get your tax record correct and up to date. If you filed as a resident in the past instead of a non-resident, what you need to do now is to submit an amended tax return, which is the 1040X, along with a correct non-resident tax return. Now again, both of these things are things that Sprintax can assist with. So if you need to catch up with a previous year, you just log into your Sprintax account or create an account if you don't have one yet, select the year you need to file, answer the questions based on that year, and do that then for each year that you need to catch up on. So you do need to go through the process separately for each year. We'll generate the relevant forms for you then, and you can get them submitted. If you need to amend a tax return you've already filed, what you do is log in, select the year. Underneath the year, there's a little radio button that says, I need to amend a tax return that I've already submitted to the IRS. Select that and proceed from there, and we'll guide you through the amended tax return process. So looking then at the implications of not filing. So what are the actual implications? Well, the first one here, and most importantly, is that non-residents are required to comply with all US laws, including IRS and filing tax forms, even if it is just that Form 8843. So it's part of your visa conditions. But the one we've highlighted here, and the one we'll always continue to emphasize, is the impact that it could have on your future immigration status. So, there may be some of you on today's session that would like to stay in the US or apply for a change of status in future. It is very likely that you will be asked in your visa interview for evidence of tax compliance. So it's really important that your tax record is correct and up to date for every year that you've been in the US. Also, if it's a case you owe tax to the IRS, they could apply fees and penalties, and interest can accrue on that. But I suppose lastly, you might actually be missing out on a refund. And the only way that you can claim your tax refund is through submitting your tax return. So firstly, and most importantly, it's part of your visa conditions. It could impact your future immigration status, but you might also be due a refund. So, another nice little benefit of submitting that there. And finally, before I hand over to Jonathan to cover the using Sprintax returns overview, just one last slide about being careful about the options being recommended to you. So we've taken a little snippet from the TurboTax help page here, where they're asked, does TurboTax handle Form 1040 NR for non-resident aliens? So they're saying, although TurboTax doesn't support the IRS Form 1040 NR, we have partnered with Sprintax to offer federal and state tax preparation. So they're telling you themselves they do not prepare non-resident tax returns. But unfortunately, if you were to go onto their website and enter your information, they won't stop you. They'll let you go through, they'll let you enter all your information, and they'll generate a 1040 for you, which is the resident tax return, where what you need is the 1040 NR, the non-resident version. So it's really important that you are aware of your tax position and that you are submitting a correct tax return. But for anyone that's unsure, like I said earlier, if you just go in and complete step 1 on Sprintax, we'll work that out for you. And at least then you know you're filing the correct tax return. But Jonathan will show you in the next portion now what that looks like. So passing over to you there next, Jonathan.
Thanks, Elvira. So as she mentioned, I'll be talking about using Sprintax returns. So first things first, you'll receive an email from your school or institution that'll look very similar to this. This will contain your link for using your Sprintax account, as well as the unique code, which will show in step 3 of the email. All right, once you click on the link, you'll be brought to this login page here. If you've used this or our site before, you'll see the blue login button on the top right-hand corner. If you haven't, you'll see the orange button on the left-hand side that says Get Started. Clicking on either one of these will go ahead and begin the process for you, depending on if you've used this before or not. All right, and once you log in and get all settled, you'll be brought to the very first step, which will be a residency status page. This is where we'll ask about your time in the US, and we'll use the substantial presence test for your residency for tax purposes. Now, keep in mind, that if you are seen as a resident for tax purposes, we're going to stop you at this step, and we'll go ahead and recommend you to our partner TurboTax to complete the tax preparation process. One thing to also keep in mind is that we're going to need to look at all of your time in the US. So if you've even come here as a child on vacation with your family or for any other reason, we'll need to know every date that you've entered in the US. Now you might be wondering, what if I don't know the exact dates? That's okay. We just need an approximation so that way we can figure out the substantial presence test for you. So if you know sometime in December, use your best guess and try to determine the number of days that you were here with the visitation of the status. Moving right along, the next thing we'll ask is for your income details. These will be all the information provided from your W-2s, your 1042Ss, or any 1099s you've received. So we'll be able to upload them using our OCR optical character recognition software here. So you'll be able to upload those. Make sure the documents are clean. They're not very scattered or anything of that sort. We just need to upload that information and we'll be able to pull it from there. Now you might also be wondering, what if something happens, something goes wrong? You'll notice that on the bottom right-hand corner are our support buttons. The green button will be for our live chat system. Here, you'll be able to access our team to be able to help you through any problems or questions you may have. The blue button will bring you to our knowledge base, where we have detailed documents and breakdowns of anything you might be wondering about the tax preparation process. Please feel free to use both options, one filing your forms with us so that way you can get all of the information you need. Our tax team is available 24/7 throughout the tax preparation season. Now next, if you trigger a state filing tax return, we will bring you to the next stage here. This is where you may need to include additional information for your state returns. We will give you the option to choose if you want to file your state returns with us or not, and you'll see that option on the state return page. It'll look something like the right-hand picture. On the left-hand side, also keep in mind that if you work in multiple states or you've gone to different states and received income, you may trigger multiple state filing requirements depending on your circumstances. Now here, once you've completed everything, will be the order breakdown. At the end of the process, you will see every option that you have for payment for the various different returns or filings you may need. So it'll show your federal and your state, for example, if you need to. One thing to keep in mind, here is where you'll be able to input your code provided by your institution for waiving whatever fees they may be assisting you with. So please make sure to use the validate button before moving forward. All right, once you've done that and you've paid, you will see the option to download your files. This is where you'll also see the option to e-file. So if you are eligible to e-file, you will see a blue button that says proceed with e-filing. Now the IRS has various criteria for e-filing, which you'll have options here with the various links on the left-hand side. So if you have any questions about that, please make sure to take a look here. As Elvira mentioned, we will make this video available to you so you don't need to write this down. If you're ineligible to e-file for whatever reason, you'll be able to generate your forms on this page here, and it'll look much like this. We like to call this our tax pack or our tax packet forms, but essentially this will contain all of the information you need to mail your forms directly to the IRS and the state IRS agencies. This will give you the breakdowns of how much you may owe or you may receive as a return, and this will also show you how to mail the information. Please make sure to follow the instructions because any misstep can delay your process. So please take your time and mail everything to the correct places. Now, as I mentioned briefly before, we have support, but here are some of our additional support options so that you have all of the information you may need. We have educational tax videos on YouTube. We have our blog for tax awareness. As I also mentioned, we have our 24/7 live chat where you'll be able to ask our tax team any questions you may need. You also have our Sprintax forums page, and as well as our various workshops and webinars like this one. So please feel free if you have any additional questions to come by another webinar. We'll be more than happy to help.
Great. Thank you, Elvira and Jonathan. I'm going to jump in now and answer some questions. But before I do, I just want to clarify. So with Columbia, there is an automatic link, and we posted that in the chat. So do have a look. That brings you to the Columbia ISSO tax page. And I'd recommend that everybody reads through that tax page. There's a ton of great information there. And also it'll provide you with the link that will give you the cost of the federal removed. So the ISSO office has sponsored the cost of the federal return, which is normally $55. Please do ensure that you are using that link. It's the only way to get that discount. If you don't use the link, obviously it's not going to apply. And if you get to the final page, which is the order review page, and you see that the federal discount is not applying, please don't proceed on. You can reach out to the live chat team. They'll be able to assist you, or else you can retry that link and just ensure you're using that to receive your discount. There's a couple of questions that came in around tax treaties. So we're not going to go into the details of tax treaties on a webinar like this, but the good news is the Sprintax software has everything you need and every test to determine if there is a tax treaty that is applicable to you. So it's the same questionnaire for your federal and your state and your form 8843. So once you go in and fill that out, the software will work its magic and it's going to advise you if you do have any applicable tax treaties. There's also, understandably, always a lot of questions from attendees asking, am I a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes? Again, we wouldn't really be able to answer that on a session like this, but step one of the Sprintax software, as Jonathan mentioned, will answer that question for you. So we're always going to refer you back to that step one. So we can have a look now and see if there's anything trending. I know we got to a lot of questions throughout that session, but we can have a look and see what questions are popping up. I guess one thing I did see, and it came in again, so there's a couple of questions from attendees that are independent contractors. So just a note, if you're an independent contractor versus an employee, it doesn't really matter when it comes to your non-resident tax return. You know, essentially it is income, and you'll still need to do a federal return. Depending on the amount of income, you may need to do a state return. And obviously, if you've been here on your non-resident visa for any number of days in 2025, you'll also need to do form 8843. So I know sometimes it can be confusing and you might think there's a distinction, but don't worry. The process that we went through is still applicable to you.
Can jump in with one, Neil, if you like.
Great.
So I've got, how should international students file US taxes if they have income in their home country and they've already filed taxes there? So as a non-resident in the US, you only need to report your US source income. Any income you receive from your home country doesn't need to be reported on your non-resident US tax return. So as a non-resident, it's just your US source income needs to be included.
Great. So there's a question here. So Sprintax is asking me to pay a bill. So I guess with the link, it's going to take the cost of the federal return off. If you do have a state return, you will cover that cost yourself. The only other maybe item that you might see that you might owe, if for some reason tax was under withheld throughout the year, you may owe the IRS money. Now, in the same vein, if you paid too much tax throughout the year, you will receive a refund. But that money doesn't go to Sprintax. We'll provide you with instructions on how you pay the IRS. So just wanted to clarify that question. And then the next question underneath that is there a specific form for fellowships? I guess, again, on the tax return side, it's all income. If you're a non-resident, it still will be reported on the 1040 NR for the federal side of things and a state return, depending on how much that fellowship was. If you're referring to the end of year tax summary, so for instance, the form you'll get that you'll input into Sprintax, generally fellowships will be reported on a 1042S. Now that can change, but I would say for the most part, a 1042S would likely provide you with information on your taxable fellowship.
Great, another one on my side, Neil. So on a J1 visa, I'm exempt from federal taxes for the first 2 years. For the third year onwards, do I have to repay the federal taxes for all years I stayed in the US? So no, you wouldn't have to repay taxes for the first 2 exempt years. I suppose once you're into your third year, the substantial presence test is used to determine if you're resident or non-resident. If you're resident from year 3 onwards, you'll submit a resident return and you'll pay taxes accordingly. But for those first 2 years, you filed correctly as a non-resident, you don't need to change anything there.
Great. A couple of questions then. Would I still have access to Sprintax after graduation for filing for 2026? So yes, Sprintax is open, all year long. It's available. If you're a non-resident, you can continue to use Sprintax even if you've left Colombia. So there's no issue there. Next up, when do we file? Will the ISSO office reach out? I guess consider this your notice to file. We're now in the middle of tax season, so you're good to go in and update your Sprintax account and get that return prepared. Next up, is a US bank supposed to provide a tax form for any interest that I receive? So generally you will receive a 1099 for that interest, so do keep an eye out for that. Obviously it depends on the type of account you have, but the 1099 document would generally be the most applicable. And then the next question. Yep, go for it.
Sorry, Neil. Just give you a break from them. So is the substantial presence test independent of visa? If I spend 120 days on a J1 visa and 63 days on a visa waiver, I still meet the 183 days of the substantial presence test. So there's tons of questions there about entry and exit dates and substantial presence test and so on. And it's really hard to answer questions like that on a session like this without asking you more information about your entry and exit dates in and out of the US. So the best thing to do there is to go in and complete step 1 on the Sprintax software. We'll work everything out for you. There's no fee or anything for that. So if you're unsure, just go in and complete step 1 and we'll work it out for you there.
Great. There's a question here about how you actually get your return to the IRS or the state office. So not everybody will be eligible to e-file their federal returns. The majority will. And if you are eligible, Sprintax is going to advise you on your screen how to e-file it. And that can all be done online. For the state return, you will need to physically mail that, but we will give you very clear instructions on what to do and where to mail that form. So let's see what else is trending in the chat. There are a couple of questions on visits, and do you need to just report visits on your current visa, or is it all of your visits, including past tourism, or you could be here for business? You do need to, on that step 1, you do need to include all of your visits, not just on your current F or J visa, and you need to go right back to your first ever visit to the US. You can look on i94.gov. I believe that gives you the last 10 years, which can be quite helpful. But after that, you really should be making a good estimation.
I have a question here, Neil, on what is a W4, and I've seen this question come up previously where somebody had received a W4 and not a W2 and wondered what the difference was. So the W4 is a document that you would generally provide to your employer so that they would know the correct amount of federal tax to withhold from your wages. The W2 then is the income document that you would receive from your employer or the person that pays the wages to you, outlining how much you earned, how much tax was withheld on that, and so on. So the W4 is what we call a pre-employment tax form, ensures that you're taxed correctly on your federal, on your federal taxes. And the W2 then is the income document that you may receive at the end of the year if you've received wages or salary, for example.
Great. There's a question asking, with a tax treaty, do I receive a full refund of the federal withholding? It really does depend on the tax treaties. They vary quite a bit, but rest assured, Sprintax is going to advise you of all of that if there is an applicable tax treaty. There's another question here from somebody who worked in multiple states and they're wondering how that's going to work. So again, it's all based on the one questionnaire. So once you fill it out, Sprintax is going to run our internal tests. We're going to determine if you've triggered one or multiple or maybe no state filing requirements. And based on that, then we'll advise you what you need to do next with those state returns. This particular question asked about double taxation for both of those states, and that's all included. So don't worry, we'll cover all of that once you complete the questionnaire.
Great. I've got another great question here, Neil. After I completed the form and received the Form 8843 tax form from Sprintax, do I need to mail the hard copy to the IRS? And this is a great question and really important because Form 8843, if it's on its own, if you didn't receive any income at all and it's just Form 8843, it will always need to be physically mailed. You can't e-file Form 8843 on its own. Similarly, if you've triggered a state filing requirement, that can't be e-filed. That will always need to be mailed as well. So the only one that could be e-filed if you meet the IRS criteria is the federal return, the 1040 NR. So if it's Form 8843 on its own, or if you've triggered state, they will always need to be physically mailed.
Great. There was a good question that I just saw, and I seem to have lost it, but I remember the gist of it. Essentially, this person is asking if they received a scholarship from Columbia, but they never actually received that scholarship. It just made a deduction from their tuition. Do they need to include that? Generally, no. So if that is a tuition-related scholarship and only tuition, that's non-taxable. And now the reason I slightly hesitated there, if it was, let's say, a scholarship that gave you income that you use for your tuition, then that would be taxable. But obviously, if you've never seen it and it just goes directly off your tuition, that's a non-taxable scholarship.
Great. Another one here, Neil. Is Form 8843 required to be filed even if we do have taxable income? And again, that's another great question. So yeah, Form 8843 is the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents in the US. If you have received taxable income, then you do trigger the federal filing requirement, which is the 1040 NR. But in that case, Form 8843 will be prepared alongside that. So in your completed tax pack, you'll see the 1040 NR and the Form 8843, and you'd submit both of them then together.
Great. There's a question here. Colombia is withholding too much regarding a tax treaty. Can I change this? So generally, if you're receiving any income, whether that's from Colombia or maybe an employer, in order for the correct amount of tax to be withheld, you do need to fill out the correct pre-employment forms or pre-withholding forms. So for instance, let's say this was a taxable scholarship. Colombia will ask you generally at the start of the year to fill out an online questionnaire via software. And once you fill out that software, the software will look at all of your details and will determine if you are eligible for a tax treaty or not. And if you are, they'll ask you to fill out Form 8233. So generally, in terms of withholding, schools like Columbia and other schools will be fairly accurate in terms of how much tax they're withholding if you have completed that software. And if you are receiving income from Columbia, you will be added into that software, and generally you'll get a link, and that will all come from the payroll office. You don't need to reach out on that. They'll proactively reach out for you. If for some reason too much tax was withheld on any income that you received, don't worry, it's not lost. You can always get that back via your tax return. So your tax return is really the opportunity that you're balancing the books with the IRS, whether too much tax was withheld or maybe you underpaid tax.
I have a follow-up question just on the last one I answered there, Neil. So if Form 1040 NR will be e-filed, then Form 8843 will also be sent along with it. And yes, in that circumstance, if you've triggered the federal filing requirement and you can qualify to e-file, in that instance, Form 8843 will be e-filed with it. But if it's Form 8843 on its own, you can't e-file it. It needs to be mailed in that case.
Perfect. So I'm just conscious of the time. You might get one or two more questions in. I can see there was a couple of questions from attendees that may have submitted an incorrect tax return in previous years. I'm going to post a blog article into the chat, which will give you information on how to amend your non-resident tax return. So that should answer any questions that you may have around that.
And I suppose just to mention the other supports that are available there as well. I think we're fairly up to date on questions. There may be a couple we didn't get to, but if there's anything we didn't get to answer, you have access to the 24/7 live chat and the knowledge base when you're logged into your Sprintax account. And of course, there's the YouTube channel and the Sprintax blog available as well. So you have tons of supports in terms of getting your questions answered. But let's see if there's maybe one more we can answer before we finish up. For J2 dependents, I have to physically mail the Form 8843. Yes, so Form 8843 will always need to be physically mailed. That can't be e-filed.
Great. Thanks very much, Elvira. And thank you everybody for joining today. It looks like we got to the majority of questions. There may be one or two that we missed, but obviously, as Elvira mentioned, there's a ton of supports that you can use as you go through your tax return. But we appreciate everybody joining. We hope it was beneficial, and the very best of luck with your 2025 tax return.